truth,
love,
and the good.
here we go.
Welcome to the DTPHD Podcast. I'm David Tian, your host, and I'm here with our guest, Henry CHONG.
Yes, hello.
And for over the past 12 years now, I've been helping hundreds of thousands of people in over 87 countries attain success, happiness, and fulfillment in life and love. And there's my spiel. And Henry, please introduce yourself.
I am Henry CHONG. I am the CEO of Fusang. We're a private investment group, and we're doing lots of really interesting projects now, including relating to technology like the blockchain.
Very cool. So we are currently in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And
At the Trump Hotel.
at the Trump Hotel, of all places. And Henry is based in Hong Kong. And I am based in Singapore and Bangkok and Taiwan. And we flew all the way out here and meet up here in Vegas.
To do this podcast.
Exactly, to do this podcast, also to do Mastermind Summit and some other business conferences. So anyway, pretty cool we're here in Vegas. So the topic that we've chosen for today is antifragility, or how to be anti-fragile. And I take this as inspired by the book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called Antifragile. You have not yet read this, right?
Only bits and pieces.
Okay, cool. It's a weighty tome. It's pretty dense, but it's quite repetitive, so that helps in the recall of it. But it's actually a really good book. This is my very first Taleb book. I have skimmed in the bookstore standing there, Black Swan and other books like this, his other books. Black Swan in particular, I picked up the gist of it through the title. And I was just sort of like, yes, there are such things, and yes, they suck. And there wasn't a solution. And then Antifragile is his solution to the Black Swan issue or problem. So Antifragile is sort of, in my opinion, the culmination of his narrative, broadly speaking, of how things go wrong and how you can benefit from that. And I found that there were quite a lot of applications to your personal life from the concept of antifragility. Yeah. So let me just put it out there what antifragility is, and then we can just dive into it. So this is by no means a review of the book, especially since Henry hasn't read it, and the fact that there are some certain chapters I haven't read yet. And if you're watching this on the video, here's what the book looks like. I'm holding it up. Got it here next to the mic. So antifragility. So it's different from straight up resilience. So I actually was reading this book while watching The Defenders, this Netflix TV show where I watched it on Netflix anyway. It's a Marvel comic book based character story arc in New York City. And The Defenders includes Daredevil, Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones. Yeah. And I've watched them all. I don't know if I should be proud of that at all. Anyway, so I thought the contrast between... So I thought it was a good way to illustrate what the difference is between anti-fragile and resilient. So Luke Cage is a character who has impenetrable skin, unbreakable skin. And he can withstand like a rocket launcher to his face, and it would just bounce off him or something. But he might be knocked unconscious from the impact. But anyway, it wouldn't penetrate his skin. So there's that. There's Luke Cage, and then there's a guy named Iron Fist, which was I wanted to hate it because it was cultural appropriation from way back. But it's actually a pretty entertaining series. It's always the case. Like all this cultural appropriation, I want to hate, but I love because like Doctor Strange. Anyway, so Iron Fist was actually quite entertaining. And the story is, especially the beginning of the series, he's not able to conjure up the chi of his Iron Fist. So once he has his Iron Fist chi, the Iron Fist is like the force that, what's it called? The immovable, it's the force that can break anything, right? So it's interesting because Luke Cage's face is the immovable force. So what is that? Like the
unstoppable force in the movable object.
Yeah, immovable object, right. So that's Luke Cage, and then Iron Fist is the immovable... Well, anyway, so he's got that fist, and it can knock out Luke Cage from the impact. But anyway, Iron Fist, in the early part of the series, was able to conjure up his chi to make the Iron Fist only when the prison guards beat him up. So he was saying earlier in the series, he gets stronger the more he gets hit. And because no one was hitting him, he wasn't able to focus his chi. And the more you beat on him, the stronger he gets until he finally gets the chi of the Iron Fist and just wipes everybody out. And later on in the series, he gets better and better through meditation and other means of focusing his chi. We won't go there. So that's a good illustration of anti-fragile versus just super strong and resilient and can bounce back. So Luke Cage is resilient. No matter what you throw at him, he can bounce back and it won't harm him. And that's like the ideal resilient character. Iron Fist is the opposite, and in that sense, he's actually stronger because he gets stronger the more he gets hit. So that's anti-fragile.
Yeah.
And of course, there's fragile. So there are three grades. There's fragile, resilient, and anti-fragile. So fragile is you get hit and you fall apart. Okay, so that's obviously bad if you want to be strong. But what's not so intuitive is resilient and anti-fragile. And the more I talk about this with people, and let's see if you fall into this trap, Henry, you end up going back to resilience as the idea for anti-fragile, but it's not. They're actually two different things. In life, you can be resilient up to a certain point, and that's when you meet a black swan. So you think you got it all covered because based on history, like what you've seen before, you can meet it. Your weakness is what you've never seen and what you could never predict. Black swan, that'll wipe you out. And someone who's anti-fragile is basically, or something that's anti-fragile, is something that will derive even more strength from the black swan. So a black swan event won't end them. It will actually make them stronger. Okay, so putting that out there, in our personal lives, we want to think about how to be not just resilient, but anti-fragile. And it gets really weird when you think about it that way, because then you're basically asking yourself, okay, what's the worst case scenario? And whatever that is. How could I actually get stronger as a result? Yeah. Right? And one way of thinking, so I started to ask myself this as I worked my way through the book. And the book is largely about societal-wide issues. And he illustrates each of these principles he puts out there with personal examples, like examples on the individual level as well, which triggered my thinking about personal application. But a lot of the more serious parts are about the economy or history. But anyway, in the individual level, let's say maybe my business is going to fall apart. And someone who's resilient would just be like hoping that it wouldn't and trying to save up enough money to withstand any kind of crash. So that's somebody who puts away 6 months or more of capital reserve or something like that. And eventually they hit a black swan and they get wiped out, largely because they didn't see it coming. And anti-fragile means this. If you get wiped out, you actually prefer that, which is weird. So I was thinking, okay, if I get wiped out, what's my plan B? And C and D and E. And I've been doing this since I was in my 20s. So I always have a backup plan. I don't know if it's just like some conservative thinking in me. So anyway, one of the backup plans is, I'll just throw this out there, one that we just sort of brainstormed with my wife. We would go to Taiwan and teach English. And while that would pay a high hourly wage. And while we're doing that, we will, on the side, open up a gym or something. And while we do that, we will, like a boutique gym, small one, just like, like one of those boutique ones. And we'll open up a smoothie stand along with it. And we'll also have a yoga studio. And then maybe we'll get a cryotherapy chamber. And we're like, yeah, okay, this sounds great. We'll add this, we'll add that one. We're like, whoa, this actually is a really good plan. Why don't we just do this? Why do I have to do this other plan A? And then your plan B becomes your plan A. So that when your plan A fails, you're like, that's great, because I've always been wanting. So I had that happen earlier in my life when I became a professor. That was always my plan A, and I became one. Yeah. And then my backup, which I never had to actually consider to be a backup, was to do this dating coach thing that was working out pretty well, and that was my fallback. And I was forced to consider that because of the way I was being treated and didn't like it at the university, and the restrictions around the way Singapore deals with humanities and social sciences. And I was like, man, actually the backup is more enticing than the current plan A. And then I switched. And I kind of wished I switched earlier. So now that's an example of what I think is an anti-fragile way of approach to these long-term plans. Yeah. Coming up with a plan B that actually is more enticing than a plan A, so that even if your plan A, if your current situation fails and you got to go to your backup, you're actually really happy about that. Yeah. So I'll just throw this out there. I've been talking a lot. Yeah. What do you think, Henry?
Well, I mean, not just, I think, antifragility in terms of growing from something breaking, but also just being able to grow from chaos or disorder, right? So, you see this in people like Sun Tzu, where he says, if you believe you are the superior strategist, then you should be willing to throw a battle into chaos, right? And most people assume the opposite. They're like, a well-regimented army is one that is highly ordered and is very disciplined and follows orders. And in the heat of the battle, will still be able to follow those orders, right? So a very resilient troop, versus an army that has been where sort of command and control has been devolved many layers down, is actually could be more anti-fragile. Stanley McChrystal wrote a really interesting book called A Team of Teams, and he talks about this. And he talks about how when they first went into Afghanistan and Iraq, they put together what they call the Joint Task Force. It was supposed to be a grouping of all of the most elite troops in the US Armed Forces, and they were fighting against ISIS, and for a while they were losing, and they couldn't understand why. They're like, we're the best trained, best resourced, best everything fighting force on the planet. How can it be that we're losing against a ragtag bunch of soldiers? And what he came to realize is that their entire military structure was built on structure. It was built upon command and control. And all the technological advances that they had in terms of allowing the very, very guy at the top, like Stanley McChrystal, to directly give orders into the earpiece of a guy about to kick down the door was actually hurting them, because it was impossible for them to adapt quickly enough in such a chaotic, fast-changing environment, versus ISIS, which had no structure, really. It was just sort of this network. There was really no leader, right? It was just sort of a general purpose and an outcome that they had, and each individual troop sort of just went off on its own, could actually adapt much, much quicker in such a chaotic environment, and that's why they were winning. To the point where I think much later on in the war, they realized that that ability to have command and control was actually hurting them, and actually they shouldn't do it at all. And even though Stanley McChrystal, in theory, could see any single troop on the front line at any time, he shouldn't give any orders. He shouldn't touch that, because that was actually detrimental. And instead, what was important was to sort of make sure everyone knew what they call the commander's intent, right? The high-level purpose, and leave it up to the ground troops to figure out how to execute. I think that's one really interesting example of how sort of small, nimble forces, especially in a dynamic, chaotic environment, can outperform the sort of classical, resilient forces. We see this in startups, right? How is it possible that a small, little, scrappy startup out of a garage can beat an incumbent firm? And we call companies incumbents because they are big and because, in theory, they have all the natural advantages. But in a fast-changing market, being able to find product market fit, being able to make sure you deliver the right product at the right time to the right people is actually far more important than all of those resources and all of that everything that can actually make a firm, fragile, right, in a sense. And you talked earlier about the difference between resilience and anti-fragility and the very, very fine line. I think that's a very important point, because to a lot of people, they say, well, just increasing resilience, right, being able to better withstand chaos, it's not the same as growing from chaos. And in nature, I think you actually see that things that are very resilient, if anything, when they hit the breaking point, tend to shatter more. So we see this in material science, right? The harder you may, and hardness in engineering is a technical term, right? The harder material is, the more prone to shattering it is, because the less malleable it is. And I think that Taleb talks, I haven't read the whole book, but Taleb talks a lot about this in terms of institutions, where the harder you make an institution, so to speak, the more resilient you make it. If it hits that tipping point, in many cases, because of the way it's been designed to be resilient, when it breaks, it really breaks. I think he talks about the financial system, right? The Paul Bretton Woods financial system we built up was exactly like that. In many ways, people designed it with good intentions to be resilient, not realizing that makes it, if it does break, prone to shattering. And one last thing, it reminds me of this quote from Hemingway that people really like to quote on Instagram. And I don't think they get his full meaning. And it goes something like, he says, the world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are broken some are stronger at the broken places. And people like to use that as an example of why you should be resilient, right? I'm going through a tough time, but hey, look, here's this great quote that just says that, if the world breaks you, you'll be stronger. That's not the full quote, right? That's just the first half. Then he goes on to say that, but those that the world does not break, it kills, whether, slowly or later. And I guess his point was that everyone breaks somehow, right? And no matter how resilient or strong you think you are, everyone has something. You may not even know it, but there's something that will hit you, that will break you. Maybe it's losing an eye, or losing a leg, or losing your wife, or something. And I guess Hemingway's point was that if you are just really, really strong, really, really resilient, the world will keep pushing until at some point it'll kill you. And what instead you need to realize is that everyone gets broken from time to time. And the key is to be anti-fragile, how you pick yourself up and rebuild from that and become stronger at the broken places. And if you don't know how to do that, the world will kill you. Right? I think it's a profound statement of the difference between resilience and antifragility that, as you say, many people just sort of miss the point.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's great. So, yeah, that chapter was fascinating. So I wasn't sure if you read that. I was like, man, how'd you know that? So, like, the issue about chaos. Chaos is a big term now in masculinity studies because chaos represents in Jungian archetype theory represents the feminine. And the masculine comes and brings order to the chaos, as opposed to like the way they talk about it in those big terms. And that's a masculine myth. It's very appealing, right? Like order for uptight guys, which is like a natural. A lot of guys who are prospects or like who contact me for help have trouble embracing the chaos. And they get caught in the trap of trying to control the chaos. And that means that it's like trying to control a woman and saying no drama, like that sort of thing. Like, don't give me any drama. Instead of meeting her presence, her chaos, so to speak, with your presence and standing strong in the storm, it's more of like, how do I contain the storm so it doesn't storm? In other words, how do I make the feminine masculine so I can be comfortable with it, right? Like that's sort of like, how can I make the feminine calm? Like me. Yeah. And that's just like killing the feminine, actually, in the end. You're killing the feminine energy in that person. And it's a really interesting point that chaos will break you. So the danger about coming up with backup plans is that you're thinking, I'm going to never be broken. And then life will challenge you, right? Like, and shit's going to happen. If you live long enough, something bad's going to happen. And instead of saying, this thing that I fear so much, let's say it does happen, right? And how can I feel that pain? How can I grow from this and become stronger? This reminds me of that Nietzsche quote that people use all the time. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Yeah. Something like that. And I just once saw a TV show where this kid was like, that's not true at all. I can think of lots of examples where something doesn't kill you, but it doesn't make you stronger, like cancer. Like, like you could lose a leg, you're not any stronger. And like in the literal sense, okay, right. But what Nietzsche, I think, was getting at was the antifragility idea, where the Black Swan event will wipe you out. And if you survive, the only way to thrive is to look for a way for that to actually not just make you give up. Yeah. And if you do survive, you actually have become stronger because now you've gone through it. And now you know that's another part, it's another data point.
But also cancer is antifragile. That's why it's
so yes, so that's the way I want to get to. So a lot of the examples on chaos is at the systemic level. It's like at the systems level. And this is a great point from the beginning of the book that kept coming up. Systems versus individual. So the higher up you go in the system, the more antifragile it becomes. So for instance, evolution or nature is antifragile up to a certain point. I mean, there are nature-ending events. I mean, there's like the planet is antifragile up to a certain point. Like maybe an asteroid big enough and it hits the Earth and the whole, or maybe the sun will implode, or But generally speaking, life is antifragile. Biological life on the Earth. So the process of evolution is antifragile. So the more chaos gets thrown into it, the stronger the result becomes. So that's just the nature of survival of the fittest, natural selection. However, that's no consolation to the person who got weeded out, right? So here's another example. Like, let's say you are the general of an army and you think you're super strong and you can meet this enemy. you didn't know that you had this weakness on your left flank or whatever. And you found out by engaging in battle with this smaller guerrilla force. And then you're like, oh shit, I saw that now. And you withdraw and you recoup, and now you're stronger and you shore up that weakness and you go back out there. And now you've responded to the challenge and you've become stronger. And you actually are thankful to those guerrillas for showing you that weakness, and now you're stronger and you beat them up. However, that's of no consolation to the soldiers who sacrificed their lives to discover that the left flank was weak. Yeah. So it's sort of like evolution. Evolution doesn't mind sacrificing individual beings. Well, evolution doesn't have a mind, I guess, but it has to sacrifice the individual for the system to get stronger. Yeah. And that's actually how society works. So no matter what, there's going to be the bottom 10%, and they will be sacrificed for the strength and the continuation of the system. Now, some systems are antifragile, some aren't. Some are fragile. And the example you gave of Silicon Valley startups, where there's like very little regulation, and it's more like evolution there, and it's like the strongest survives, and versus the big corporations where there's lots of regulation and lots of propping up and artificiality to it. That is no consolation to the startup that failed, right? And the investors who lost all their money in that startup. So at the individual level, you have to realize once you're part of a bigger system, that the system itself may not care for you, probably doesn't care for you. So you've got to care for yourself, and you got to ensure your own survival. So I'll give you an example from my experience, and then I'm going to move back to the chaos thing. A lot of guys who are struggling with women or their relationships bemoan the liberalization of feminism or the spread of radical feminism in the West. Now that women are more, assertive, they're more masculine in their energy of taking whatever they can and taking advantage of short-term mating strategies. The guys are like, oh, they're all sluts, and look what's happened, screw it, I'm going to withdraw from the game. So the thing is, though, that the game doesn't care. In fact, the game has already accounted for your withdrawal. So studies have shown, multiple DNA studies have shown, that twice as many females, and probably more, the further back in time you go, it's something like 17 females for every one male that's contributed to the gene pool. But in recent times, recent as in a few hundred years back, we have 2 females for every male that's contributed to the gene pool. That means like for every 2 females that have had a baby, there's been 1 male that's sired, so it's contributed to the. So that means that half the males that have been alive, more than half, because if you could go far back in history enough, and the fact that as far as we can see in history, it's been a 1-to-1 male to female ratio of babies that have been born. That half the males who have existed in human history, actually more than half, have not contributed to the gene pool. In other words, evolution has weeded them out. And this has made the ensuing race of Homo sapiens stronger. And just looking in totality of evolution, stronger. So the panda should have been extinct by now, but because of artificial means, we've kept these cuddly, cute creatures alive, and I'm very happy for that. But they would be dead too. So, but nature doesn't care whether pandas are alive or not. And you might think, oh, that's good, but then you're the panda. Yeah. And a lot of these guys are like, I'm going to take myself out of commission, and that's a punishment to the system. The system is happy about that. The system wants that. So if you're bitching and moaning about taking yourself out of the game, and like as punitive measure to the society, society is happy for that. Other dudes are happy for that. So then, the remaining dudes should be applauding this, because now there's a lot less competition. There are more females for them. And especially if you're open to that mating strategy of just casual sex everywhere. A lot of these guys are like saying, I'm going to get out of marriage and relationships. That's great. But a lot of women actually want that. So now we have, eventually, when the women figure this out, there's going to be, the tide will turn, right? But then the guys who are there to sweep that up, they're going to be there perfectly positioned for this. But the system is anti-fragile. It's already taken into account the fact that half the males will not actually contribute to the gene pool anyway. Yeah. So this bitching and moaning about this and saying, well, then I'm out. The system is happy for that. But also, going back to the earlier point about chaos, is the opposite of embracing the chaos is artificial order. And it might be top-down, right? Often it's top-down. And this was an interesting point that Taleb was making about societies or political systems and economic systems that were too tightly regulated, or too regulated. And he would say something like, there's a limit to which you want to have just free market, like completely, right? So you set a lower limit at which the government steps in or some other, rule setting thing comes in and says, okay, that's enough. It's too chaotic. It's too much, right? But beyond that, you just let it flourish. So embracing the chaos. So you can think about in your personal life. Well, let me just throw this out to you, Henry. How would you apply this idea of order and chaos and regulation and so on to your personal life? How could you benefit from this personally?
Well, I think it's really interesting that a lot of man-made systems are resilient or fragile, right? Whereas a lot of systems that arise in nature are anti-fragile. And I think it's exactly what you said. I mean, systems obviously evolve themselves, but even within evolution as a dynamic, the point is if you're not anti-fragile, you got weeded out.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of biological processes are anti-fragile, or at least should be. So for example, we're not designed to eat constantly at exactly the same interval. Our bodies are designed to intermittent fast from time to time. Why? The people whose bodies had to eat every 4 hours didn't last very long in the savannas of Africa, right? The people whose bodies were adapted to eat irregularly, you never know when the next meal is going to come, those are the genes that perpetuate it. And so over time, all of these biological systems became anti-fragile because the ones that weren't disappeared, right? And our bodies, this is true for most things, right? We have these homeostatic processes that you need stresses from time to time. Exercise is obviously one of them, right? Yes, there's a point at which too much is bad, but you need those periodic stresses to grow. And I think it's really interesting to think about why that's the case. Why is it that these anti-fragile systems have, in nature, right, in that where things were allowed to evolve on their own, why have these things perpetuated? And I think it's exactly what you say, because of chaos. Chaos is a technical term in math, right? If you talk to a statistician, they'll separate the world into two halves. One half is what they call random. And random, again, is a technical term. It really means I just cannot predict an output from an input, right? It's completely random. And then on the other side, you have determinism, where it's very linear, right? Linear inputs, linear output. I can predict exactly what the output is, like 2 + 2 = 4, for a variety of reasons. But in between, you have what you call the edge of chaos. And these are chaotic systems. And again, that's a very technical definition. And a chaotic system is one in which inputs lead to outputs. Very specifically, it's not random. There is causality, but it's very, very difficult to predict the output from the input, right? So once I have the output, I can go backwards and see how it came to be, but I cannot predict in advance. The weather is something like, is a classical example where small changes to the input result in huge changes to the output. So much so that it is almost impossible to predict the weather 7 days out, right? Tomorrow, fine, 7 days out, almost impossible, right? Probably no better than chance. And there are most natural systems, most biological systems are chaotic in nature, in that we can see logically how outputs follow from inputs, but doesn't mean that we can ever predict. And because of that, given that most systems in life, in the real world, are chaotic, it means that sooner or later, you will hit a situation in which you could not have predicted and you could not have foreseen. Again, statisticians separate into two kinds of what they call risk and uncertainty, right? Now, risk, again, in math is a very specific definition. It means that you can calculate the probability distribution. So when I flip a coin, there is what a math person will call risk, right? 50-50 chance, roughly, of heads or tails. I know exactly the distribution. I can't predict if it's going to be heads or tails, but I can predict the probabilities. That's risk. And then you have what we call uncertainty, or Knightian uncertainty, after an economist who sort of first popularized the idea, which just means that I don't even know the probability distribution, right? So again, imagine I've got 2 urns of black balls, red balls. If I know exactly how many balls are in each, I don't know which ball I'm going to get, right, when I sort of put my hand into the urn, but I know roughly the percentage. But if I know that there's a jar, an urn with red balls and black balls, but I don't know how many, I'm probably going to get one or the other, but I don't know. It's impossible for me to make any useful statement about which one. I think that's exactly what Taleb talks about in his earlier books, like about the Black Swan, where many of these things, even though we think we understand the probability distribution, we actually don't. And that's why they're so dangerous. Because we don't actually understand the probability distribution, it's very difficult to prepare for it in a linear fashion because I just don't know what's going to happen, right? I don't know if I'm going to get a red or a black ball. So if I have a strategy that is dependent heavily on me picking correctly a red or a black ball, you know what? I might be fine for a very, very long time. And that's why, for years and years, it may seem like I'm okay until one day I hit that one scenario and it breaks me, right? And that's exactly how it works in a lot of financial markets. During good years, it all seems fine, right? Everything seems great until that one scenario you couldn't foresee happens, and then boom, it all blows up. And we see this time and time and time again in all these financial crises. And Talib's point is that unless your strategy has a way of dealing with that, an outcome which you cannot foresee, unless your strategy at a very base layer is anti-fragile, sooner or later, inevitably, you will hit that road bump, that scenario, and then everything will blow up. And again, in a long enough time frame, like nature, sooner or later, your strategy is going to get weeded out. Your genes are going to get weeded out. And so the question is, okay, if I'm playing the long game, how do I make my strategies anti-fragile so that even if I need to forego short-term gains, long-term I'm set up to win? And I guess to give you a very specific example, investing in the financial markets, I think is a great example of this, where there are lots of ways of optimizing a portfolio. Right? There's a lot of math theory around what people call things like modern portfolio theory, of how you exactly optimize what your portfolio allocation should be. But that all assumes that you can calculate the inputs, and it assumes that you can calculate the future probability distribution. So things like expected return and risk. Now, if you think you can calculate all of that, good for you, right? But for a lot of people, all they do is they take historical returns and they extrapolate it into the future. And most of the time, that works fine, because most of the time, tomorrow is the same as yesterday, right? That is how nature works most of the time, what you call heteroscedasticity, right? So, it's not random, right? The future does depend on the past. The problem is not always. And every now and then, it looks very, very different. And if you have over-optimized and you walk too close to the edge, there's no room for error. And you hit one of those scenarios and boom, your portfolio blows up. On the other hand, you have, again, what people like Tyler very specifically advocate in the financial markets is it's often better long-term to not walk so close to the edge and not over-optimize and go a bit below and have that margin of safety, as Warren Buffett calls it, because you never really know. And so you better make sure that if your portfolio has a margin of safety, when that scenario happens, whatever maybe that Black Swan happens, and you are in a position to benefit from this order, that's not just the way in which you outperform, that is the only way in which you can survive long term. And to finish off, Warren Buffett has this great quote I always like, and he's like, I only invest in businesses that morons could run, because sooner or later they will.
Yeah. Damn it, that was the quote I was just about to give. Yes, that's right. Yeah, Warren Buffett. Now, one of the examples along the same lines that Taleb gave, I think, was the Fukushima nuclear disaster, right? So they're still dealing with that now and may be forever. And that was, one of the problems was they didn't consider the fact that, the probability, or the possibility that there could be something that, like a Black Swan event that blows out the whole thing. And unfortunately, they had so much of the nuclear reactors concentrated in one area. And what they are now doing in Japan is they're putting smaller reactors all over to spread out the risk, so to speak. But it was something that they just couldn't foresee because they were looking at historical patterns. And that's always going to leave you vulnerable to Black Swan issues, or events. Now, one of the solutions, as you were getting to, was like a more balanced portfolio. So if you're thinking about it in terms of investments. And he gave this interesting example of extremes. He calls it the dumbbell theory, or dumbbell approach. And that is where at the extremes, the extremes are where you should live. And the middle is the most dangerous position. So for instance, in a portfolio that's balanced like this, where 90% of the assets are in very safe conservative markets, or I don't know what you'd call it, but very safe vehicles. Yeah. And then you have 10%, which you've decided you can risk and lose all of it. And that's in super high risk, but very high return.
But not just high risk, high return. It should be asymmetric risk.
Yes,
return.
Asymmetric, like that. Right? Yeah, so opposite.
Ideally, you invest into these opportunities where maybe you lose all your money. So I lose 1x or I make 10x. Those are the kind of things you want to invest in.
Right. So you win no matter which way it goes. And that's much safer actually than having a middle of the road, like 80% safety. Like, so if the whole thing is like 50-50 or 80-20, or like you could get blown out. You could lose it all because and that's actually what happened in 08, where there was all of these middle risk, or what would you call that? Like middle level risk portfolio, where you think, okay, I kind of want to be in the middle. Like a lot of people like safety in the middle, right? So if they have a menu choice and they just had to choose, they'll usually choose the middle option. It's the safe option. And actually, that's the most dangerous option in life, because you lose. You'll lose on a Black Swan event. Whereas if you you play both ends, you're going to win no matter what. And this leads to the solution. So we kind of have to get to the solution. So we're understanding the dangers of being just resilient or just strong, and you're susceptible to Black Swan events and unpredictable outcomes or inputs. And what'll happen is, if you play the extremes, you're safer. But how do you do that in your personal life besides just your portfolio? Yeah. So he gives an example, I think somewhere in the beginning, of in Greco-Roman times. I can't remember if it's Greco or Roman. There was a mother who suspected that her son was going to poison her. So she instructed the pharmacist or the apothecary to give her small doses of the most popular poisons and give them to her over a period of time so that she became immune to them. Just up the dose each time, so that she was now immune to these poisons. And lo and behold, her son did try to poison her, and she was not able to be poisoned. And she found out, and I don't know what she did with the son. She punished him somehow, probably killed him. But then she decided. I think she felt so bad that she killed her son. She wanted to kill herself. She took the poison, but the poison she can't. So she had to actually order one of her servants to like chop off her head or something, because now she can't poison herself. So, anyways, this is like the downside of being too anti-fragile. But that's actually one solution to developing anti-fragility in your life. Thinking about what could be a Black Swan wipe you out event, and how can I take small enough doses of that over a long period of time that I can become anti-fragile to it. So I can actually start to prepare for that eventuality in these minute amounts that I can handle. Because if you suddenly take on hey, I'm going to practice being stabbed, right? That's probably a bad idea. Or I'll practice getting knocked out. Knock me out, right? Not great. But if you practice conditioning yourself to being hit and then gradually build that up, you'll become stronger and stronger over time, so that when you do get hit or knocked out with a very powerful blow, you'll stand a much better chance. In fact, over time, you become anti-fragile. So this is actually how inoculations work. What do you call those? Antibiotics work, right? So they give you minute doses, or like small enough doses that you can handle, and your system can come back. And what will happen is your body says, oh, damn, that was bad. Let me prepare for the next dosage. And you actually overcompensate. Your body overcompensates for it, so you can handle a stronger dose. So as the product of evolution, you are already anti-fragile biologically. Over time, you're the product of evolution, which is in itself anti-fragile. So you actually have built into you this ability to overcompensate for getting hit again with that same thing.
I think you need a balance, though, between resilience and anti-fragility. It's very difficult to be all anti-fragile in any given dimension for, I think, two reasons. One is just it's really hard. Not only is it hard, I want to work, but again, I think people fall into the trap of saying things like, okay, so a vaccine, right? Taking a vaccine is, the way the vaccine works is anti-fragile, but trying to get yourself inoculated against every possible disease is kind of, again, falling back into the trap of trying to be resilient. And the whole point of this is that it is very, very difficult to ever predict everything. And so you can never prepare for everything. And really the question is, given that shit will come and it will hit you, how do you then recover from that? As opposed to, again, just being like, how do I just prepare for everything? Because then you fall back into the trap of just being resilient. So, I think the Stoics used to talk a lot about this and say, look, you should try and prepare as best as you can for every scenario you can, but sooner or later something will come that you just couldn't have foreseen, right? And the question is just, how do you pick yourself up from that? They talked about like premeditation, about, imagining the worst possible things that could happen to you as a way of making you more resilient, but recognizing that, again, there are always things that will break you, and how do you sort of pick yourself up from that? So I think you need a balance, right? You want to try and be as resilient as you can in life, while also recognizing that things will come. And it is very hard to be specific about those kind of scenarios. And it's more about just preparing yourself mentally, and if anything, sort of mentally shaping yourself to live in that mode, to say, look, things will come that I can't foresee. How do I grow from them? And also the other reason why I think you need a balance of both is that, again, maybe to come back to sort of the financial portfolio example, because I think that's quite clear, is exactly like Taleb says, if you have 90% of your portfolio that's very safe, that's resilient, right? And then you want a small portion of your portfolio that's antifragile, that grows from it. And you need both, because with a financial portfolio, I can diversify. So I can say, all right, well, if I have these asymmetric bets where I have a 50% chance of losing all my money and a 50% chance of making 10x my money, that's a really good bet to make if I can make a lot of them. If I can make 10 of those bets, you should definitely do it. If you can make one of those bets, it's not so clear. Then the answer is, it depends. Is this your last dollar, right? If you're betting your last dollar, maybe not, right? But if you can diversify, great. The truth is, in life, you can't always diversify. And there are many things that you do in which, again, you only get one at bat, or at any given time, you're doing it once. And again, the answer, I think, is not always so clear. So for example, surgery, I think is a really interesting example that I was talking about recently. And I wrote this newsletter a while back about quantum Bayesianism, which I will not get into now. But the point is that, if a surgeon goes to you and says, all right, we're going to do this surgery, it's got a 95% chance of success and a 5% chance that it will leave you, paralyzed for life. Should you do it? You're like, well, 95% sounds pretty great. I mean, as far as odds go, what more do you want? The problem is, if you're in that 5%, it's no use telling you, don't worry, I know you're paralyzed, but hey, the surgery had a 95% chance of success, so you shouldn't feel bad, right? In that world in which you are paralyzed, you don't care. Because as far as you're concerned, looking back, you now had 100% chance. You are 100%, you are paralyzed. And I call those frozen accidents, where it doesn't really matter what the probability distribution is. If that thing happens to you, it's happened, right? The chance probably is 1. And no amount of trying to convince you otherwise is going to make you feel any better. And that's why I think you need that balance, right? That's why, in poker and investing, you always make sure that you never bet your last dollar, right? That even if you lose the hand, you still have a stack and you can still keep on going, that you don't bust out. And I think again, to sort of try and come back a bit, that's what I mean by you need to be anti-fragile, the very base layer, right? In terms of personality, in terms of mindset, in terms of overall strategy of how you make bets or you invest your portfolio. That has to be anti-fragile, because it's very difficult to do it specifically for anything. Right? You need to do it sort of in a holistic way.
Yeah, well, okay, so the surgery example is good. So let's take that. So there is a way to be, so if it's an event, if it's a black swan, if it ends your life and you're not in the game anymore, well, then you can actually benefit from it, obviously. But there might be a way in which you could be anti-fragile for the surgery example. So you have 95% chance it succeeds, and that's great. So that's your conservative. And then your 5%, you die. Okay, so if you took out a life insurance policy that then takes care of your family, and you're a ghost, right? Now you're like looking, so they're like, you're a happy ghost, though, right? Well, at least my family got taken care of, right? So you're anti-fragile in that sense, like, because you didn't have all that money and now they're millionaires or whatever. I don't know what company will insure you if you're going through surgery, but whatever. So you could do, so what I took from this lesson was actually, I'm pretty resilient in life, and we've done a whole other podcast about the vantage point of trust, or the trust vantage. So where you're kind of looking on the bright side of things. So if it's retrospective, so like the event has already happened and you got fucked over, and now you're like, how can I be anti-fragile with this event, which I didn't predict, which would make it a black swan, right? And you're thinking, okay, how can I derive strength from this? How can I get stronger from this? What lessons are there to learn, and so on? That's the best you can do, because the event already happened, and now you're scrambling to like get stronger as a result. What's really genius is if you can start, because you have time now where I'm assuming you haven't hit a black swan yet. Currently, you're not dealing with one, but you can think of nightmare scenarios, and one at a time. And so this is from the section on Stoicism. Or Taleb says no Stoic philosopher, no Stoic theorist has ever understood real Stoicism, and I'll tell you what real Stoicism is. So one of the things, the main point he made there in that section was, as far as I can tell, was that the Stoics were actually saying that you can run these thought experiments, sort of like Ignatius, or whatever, we're going to stick with the Stoics. You can run these thought experiments about what would happen, what's my worst nightmare, and how can I benefit from that, while also reaping all the rewards from things going according to plan. Yeah. But things don't go to plan in a really bad way. How can I still benefit from that? And you're just running these thought experiments. And this might be a horrible way to live because you're constantly going around like, okay, plan Z. What's that going to, how can a plan Z be just as wonderful as plan A? And I can see how some people would object to this. Like, you're constantly going around thinking about the worst case scenario. And when you do that, according to The Secret, you'll be attracting it to yourself, right? And I totally get that. Most of my life is like that. However, whenever you are overly optimistic about how things will go, you're vulnerable, and you're just hoping to God you're resilient. And most of my life is lived like that. And then something hits me that I totally don't expect, and then I have to look for a way to make myself stronger as a result. And that's where that previous podcast on the vantage point of trust, where that's actually happened. So if you are anti-fragile, or if you have an anti-fragile mindset, and you've trained yourself to look for how you can get stronger as a result of getting hit, you can develop this. But I think one thing I've not been doing, not in any meaningful way, I guess I did this as an uptight teenager, and is like, if all goes to hell, actually, I didn't do this very well. I just held that fear in my mind, but I didn't come up with a good plan. How could I be stronger? And so that's that 5%, 10%, 20% of your portfolio that you're kind of hoping. Because if that goes bad, you'll actually make more than you would have if the 90% worked out for you, right? And so that way you play both sides. And that's like the worst villain, right? The villain who's playing the good guy and the bad guys, right? And either way he wins, win-win for him. Yeah. And that's the guy you can't beat because he's going to be happy no matter what. And actually, in terms of your own personal life, it's a good idea to take out a life insurance policy, if you've got dependents, so that you'll win no matter what in that sense. Like, that might be a low-level win for you because you're dead, but you're getting something. And I think a lot of people, they don't bother taking out that sort of, like, life insurance is a easy example, but they don't think about, okay, if I lose everything, if I get into a car accident, if this happens, like, how could I actually get stronger? If, God forbid something bad happens to my mother, my kids, how can we actually get stronger as a result? Yeah. And why? Because people don't like to think about these things. And that's one of the reasons why. And so a lot of people, they don't take risks because they're scared to risk that thing happening. So they play the middle, and they're middle class, middle income, middle everything. And they're B students, and they're not going to go all in on one and all, well, I guess, they're not going to go to the extremes. So there's that. Think about thought experiments for the things that you're really afraid of. And again, like this great saying from Tony Robbins, stress is the adult word for fear. Yeah. I'm really stressed about it. You're just afraid of the outcome if it doesn't happen. Well, let's face the damn thing that you're afraid of and think about how you could actually get stronger as a result. And you might like that. And you might end up saying, whoa, I kind of want that to happen. So anyway, there's that. Thought experiments about the nightmare scenarios, and then how to prepare to be stronger as a result. But also, playing the extremes means in your life, most people don't play extremes in their life. So examples of that, so a lot of guys listening to this are trying to get better in their dating and their relationships. And a lot of them suffer from playing middle. There's nothing happening nice in the middle. Right? So you should be thinking in terms of, how can I be risky? And that's very sexual, like the easygoing, adventurous guy who takes risks. And, when you're flirting, or you're out at the bar, or you're on a date, be a little bit more adventurous than you normally would be, right? Maybe you see, do not enter in some VIP area, and you just like, hey, let's go. And you go in there, you sneak in there, and it's risky, and her heart's racing, and she's like, oh, we shouldn't be here. And like, yeah, that's why we're here. And you're having fun, right? That's one extreme of the bell end, right, of the dumbbell. And then the other extreme is maybe at work, or I don't know, some other area where you've got some stability. So you put away that 6 months of wages, of like emergency backup, whatever, right? Yeah. Or you've invested, you're safe in that area, but you're risky in this other. So one area in my life is, I was in a safe career trajectory of being a professor, but then I unconsciously started dabbling in this other area, unconscious drives to have my sexual expression in that other area. And I was living that life that I just described to you. Conservative in one area, risky in another, right? Gary Vaynerchuk talks about this in terms of clouds and dirt. And then the middle is don't bother with that. Yeah. So like getting down into the nitty gritty of understanding how Facebook ads work, for instance, if you're running a small business, and then understanding up in the clouds of like the bigger picture strategy of thinking 10 years out, 20 years out, understanding brand and what that means. And that's where the magic is, at the dumbbell ends. Yeah. A lot of people are in the middle. I think that's just a bad idea.
Yeah, well, we're coming up on the hour that we said we wouldn't cross. So maybe I'll just finish off with, there's a really good friend of mine, and he always, we were classmates back at Oxford, and after 3 years of digging through all the analytic philosophy and moral philosophy and everything that there was, he's like, you know what? I think it all boils down to 2 simple principles, which I actually personally really like. And he says, 1, minimize regret. You can't go too far wrong whenever you're trying to make a decision. If you just say, whatever, like, what's the best path to minimize regret? Again, I don't really know what the potential outcomes are, the distribution, but just how do I minimize regret? That's one. And the other thing is maximize serendipity. Again, who knows what's going to happen, but put yourself in those situations to maximize the potential for serendipity. And again, I think if you do those 2 things, almost like the 2 barbells, they're kind of really safe or minimize regret, and the sort of the asymmetric risk reward of maximizing serendipity, you won't go too far wrong.
Yeah. Nice. Great way to end. You always have great quotes. So that's excellent. All right, guys. And ladies, thanks for listening. And we're wrapping up here. Join the DTPHD Podcast group. That's where you can interact with us personally, ask us questions, and we will maybe do a whole podcast for you on that question. So join the DTPHD Podcast group. You can find the link in the description for this podcast. Also, you can find me at davidtianphd.com, and I got a whole series of masterclasses that are free. So join that. Henry, how can they get in touch with you?
You can find me on my website at henrychong.com, and I write a newsletter, now monthly, because our company writes all kinds of other newsletters, but that's it. You can find that on my website as well.
Awesome. Right, henrychong.com. We'll link that in the description. Also got to link a couple books you mentioned. All right, great. And we'll link the Antifragile. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. David Tian and Henry Chong signing out. Hey, it's David again. Before you go, a couple last things. First, all the show notes and links to resources can be found at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Or you can just go to davidtianphd.com and find it through the top navigation menu. Second, if you'd like to interact with me or other like-minded fans of the podcast, then join our private DTPHD Podcast Facebook group. We've got an awesome community of intelligent, wise individuals from literally all around the world. You can send a join request to the group using the link you'll find in the show notes of every podcast at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Click the link, log into your Facebook, and then click to join. We approve join requests every day. So go to davidtianphd.com and click the link to join. See you inside our group.